Greetings, this is Greg. On January 7th, 1945, Major Tommy McGuire was leading a flight of 4 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings when they were attacked by a lone Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. In the ensuing fight, Major McGuire was killed along with one of the other P-38 pilots, a Major Jack Rittmeyer. Rittmeyer was an experienced P-38 pilot who had 4 kills to his credit. Major Tommy McGuire was not only a U.S. ace, he was the leading ace in theater at the time and the second highest scoring U.S. ace of all time. Not only that, Tommy McGuire was the author of Combat Tactics in the Southwest Pacific Area, which was the closest thing the U.S. Army Air Force had to a Bible on how to shoot down Japanese aircraft. Now you would think that a lone, obsolete Japanese fighter would have been easy prey for 4 P-38s, all flown by experienced pilots and led by Tommy McGuire himself. So what went wrong? Well, as usual, it's just not that simple. It's a combination of tactical, technical, and human factors that all converged in a bad way and at a bad time for the American pilots. I don't want to get into the backstory of every tree branch here, but an understanding of where McGuire stood in the so-called ace race of the Pacific is important to the discussion. I think the term ace race came about later, coined by a modern author, but there was certainly, among the leading aces at the time, a strong desire to become the top-scoring ace of the war. There was value in that, value beyond personal pride. There was fame, likely fortune. Everyone familiar with World War I aviation knows who Eddie Rickenbacker was. But how many can name the second highest-scoring U.S. ace of the First World War? Even tougher is naming the second highest surviving U.S. ace of the First World War. Compare that person's fame to Eddie Rickenbacker's. It's not even close. There is something to being the top-scoring ace, or the top anything for that matter, and the pilots knew that. Tommy McGuire was, for a large part of the war, behind Richard Bong in scoring, and always trying to catch up. Richard Bong got into the Pacific Theater fairly earlier than McGuire, and thus he had a little bit of a head start. For much of his career, McGuire was about 8 kills behind Richard Bong. McGuire would go out and shoot down a plane or two, come back and find out that Bong had done the same. McGuire just couldn't seem to close that gap. At one point, Bong went on leave. McGuire, being 8 kills behind at the time, thought this would be his big chance to catch up. However, Japanese targets became scarce around the same time, and about when they started to reappear, McGuire came down with malaria and had some other illness, taking him out of flying for a while. Then, of course, Richard Bong came back into theater and started running his score up again. It seemed to McGuire that he just couldn't catch a break, but he was slowly gaining on Bong. Then on December 26, 1944, Tommy McGuire shot down 4 Japanese fighters in one flight, bringing his total to 38, only 2 less than Richard Bong. Bong was scheduled to go back to the United States for good, thus it looked like McGuire would be sure to pass him up. At this point, General Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, temporarily grounded McGuire. This page is from his book explaining his reasoning. If you're listening to audio only, I'll paraphrase it for you. Kenny told McGuire that he wanted Bong to arrive home as the top-scoring U.S. ace of the war. He probably felt that Bong deserved that title, even if only for a short time, plus it would be great publicity. I also think Kenny was legitimately concerned for McGuire's health and state of mind. Whatever the case, on January 6, 1945, General Kenny received word that Bong was back in the United States. He then allowed McGuire to get back into the air. The very next day, McGuire was killed in combat. I really think the events leading up to this caused him to take chances he would not have normally taken. The title of U.S. Ace of Aces was within his grasp. Remember, less than 2 weeks earlier, he shot down 4 enemy fighters in just one day. Let's talk about the mission itself. There are several versions of it, but I think the most complete and well-researched account of this was done by Dave Mason, a World Airways captain. The details of his findings can be found on the Pacific Rex website. Sadly, Captain Mason has passed away, but he left an absolute treasure trove of information on this subject. McGuire's ill-fated flight took off at dawn around 6:20 a.m. local time on January 7, 1945. This was the planned route. After takeoff from their base on Dulag, they were to head west to Negros Island, then up to Panay Island, from there to Mindoro Island, and then back to base at Dulag. The total distance was around 750 miles. The route in this entire flight was specifically planned with the stated goal of getting McGuire 3 air-to-air kills. The route was to take the flight near some Japanese air bases on Negros Island. Then to the north, Mindoro Island was a real hotspot. Japanese aircraft had been attacking U.S. ground forces there and were expected to attack U.S. Navy ships that were operating near the island. McGuire's flight consisted of 2 P-38Ls and 2 P-38Js. These were good versions of the P-38. McGuire was not flying his personal P-38 this day, but instead one he borrowed for some unexplained reason. The other P-38L was flown by Captain Weaver, who was McGuire's wingman on this mission. Weaver was a very experienced P-38 pilot. In the 38, he shot down 4 German 109s in North Africa and had flown as a wingman for McGuire a number of times. The second element, consisting of 2 P-38Js, was led by Captain Rittmeyer. He had flown with McGuire on other occasions and had been Richard Bong's wingman. He also had 4 kills to his credit. Rittmeyer's wingman in the other P-38J was Second Lieutenant Throp. He was the least experienced of the 4, but still no rookie. Throp had flown 53 combat missions and had 1 kill to his credit. The 4 P-38s were set up for air-to-air work, meaning no bombs or rockets. They had ammo for their machine guns and cannon, and each plane carried twin 165-gallon drop tanks for the long mission. The plan was to fly at high altitude and drop down on any unsuspecting enemy. However, the weather didn't cooperate, and the 4 P-38s flew at lower altitudes below the clouds. Initially, they headed west. At one point, the 2 elements lost sight of each other due to the clouds, but were able to rejoin as they approached Negros Island. There were 4 Japanese airfields on that island, and the thinking was that the P-38s would have a chance of catching the Japanese shortly after takeoff as they headed northbound towards U.S. forces. However, any chance of getting an altitude advantage was gone as they had to stay under the clouds to navigate visually. This put the P-38s down around 1,500 feet. Navigating visually, McGuire was following a known road on the island which was lined with palm trees, making it an excellent reference for navigation. It turned out that a lone Japanese Ki-43 happened to be navigating along the island via the same method, following those palm trees but heading in the opposite direction and at a slightly lower altitude. Combat was about to begin. Before we get to that, please like and subscribe and consider joining my Patreon. Memberships there start at only $1. Members get access to all the pilot manuals and other documents I use in creation of these videos. I just added a Pacific War section at the captain's level, which has manuals for Japanese aircraft, U.S. intelligence reports on them, and much more. Back to our story. The P-38s and the lone Ki-43 are headed right for each other and at low altitude below the clouds. They're down around 1,500 feet. At this point, we need to consider that these P-38s were very heavy on fuel, still carrying their twin drop tanks. You can start to see how things were stacking up poorly for our P-38 flight here. McGuire himself was focused on getting 3 more kills as soon as possible. That had to be occupying quite a bit of space in his mind. I forgot to mention earlier, if there wasn't enough pressure on him already, he had been told he would be shipped back to the United States no later than the end of the month. With the decreasing number of Japanese aircraft and the increased number of U.S. fighters, including not only more U.S. Army Air Force fighters, now Navy and Marine Corps Hellcats and Corsairs were in the area and competing to shoot down the few remaining Japanese aircraft. All this meant that McGuire knew this could be his last chance to exceed Bong's total of 40 kills. Back to the engagement, McGuire's wingman, Captain Weaver, first spotted the Ki-43 that was coming at them head-on and about 500 feet lower. I mentioned how adverse conditions sort of stacked up in a bad way for this flight of P-38s, and here we have another one. Normally, a single Ki-43 would not be much of a threat in this situation. At this point in the war, it was an obsolete airplane, usually flown by an inexperienced pilot. However, in this case, it was a Ki-43-3 model, the latest and best version of the plane. Captain Mason's research on this shows that it was a version with water methanol injection, but I'm not so sure about that. I have seen mentions of prototype Oscar-3s so equipped, but I haven't seen anything showing production versions of the Oscar were ever equipped with water methanol injection, at least not versions that made it into combat. Either way, a Ki-43-3 in a close-in turn fight is always a force to be reckoned with. Worse, this Ki-43 was flown by Warrant Officer Sugimoto, a pilot who had been flying since early 1941, which by this point, in January of 45, made him one of the most experienced Japanese pilots still alive. It's not known what his combat record was, but considering that he had been in combat a lot of that time, I think it's likely he had some kills under his belt and may have even been an ace. Normally, the tactic to use here for the P-38s would be to drop the external tanks and then use the Lightning's superior speed to gain distance, then, if desired, circle back around and come in for an attack run. McGuire was very clear in his writings that was the tactic to use. He also made it clear never to engage in a maneuvering contest with a single-engine Japanese fighter. Yet that's not what they did here. After the merge, McGuire started a left turn, not a hard left, but hard enough to keep the Oscar in sight. However, in the second element of P-38s, Lieutenant Throp made a very hard turn. I think Throp expected the Oscar to make a run for it. The Oscar was, after all, facing 4 P-38 Lightnings. But Sugimoto, with all his experience, probably knew that trying to run here would be a death sentence, and maneuvered his plane into a tight climbing turn, and was bringing his guns to bear on Throp's P-38. Throp made a radio call, letting the others know the Oscar was bearing down on him, and McGuire's response was, quote, "Keep your tanks," unquote. Just why McGuire wanted his flight to keep their drop tanks on at this point will forever be a mystery, but I think it's very likely one of two reasons. First, he may have underestimated the Oscar pilot and thought that the 4 Americans would make quick work of him. If they dropped their tanks, they wouldn't have enough fuel to make it farther north to the better hunting grounds. That could effectively end the mission and even end McGuire's chances of becoming the U.S. ace of aces. Second, dropping the tanks in the P-38 was not a trivial task. Let's talk about what the pilots had to do to get the Lightning set up for combat when they saw that Oscar coming at them. First, they would have been operating the engines at low power, so they would have to move the mixture controls to auto-rich, the propeller controls full forward, and then bring up the throttles, and in that order. That would take them about 3 seconds or so, and it's not a big deal. Although the P-38 has 2 engines, you can in that situation just grab and move the levers 2 at a time. So it's not much different in terms of time required than it would be in a P-40 or most other U.S. single-engine fighters. What is a lot different is setting up the fuel system. Multi-engine airplanes have fuel systems that are typically much more complicated than single-engine airplanes. The P-38s in this case were burning out of external tanks. The selector valves for the P-38 types on this mission have to be in the combined off/external tank position to use the external tanks. That means if you just drop the tanks and don't do anything else, the engines will quit. Dropping the tanks isn't really that simple. There are 2 ways to do it, which I'll call the normal way and the emergency method. We're assuming the plane is in cruise with the gear and flaps up. So the normal way is this. First, with your left hand, grab the fuel selector valves and move them to select internal tanks. The valves are down low on the left side of the cockpit, thus far out of the pilot's normal field of view, and have to be moved one at a time. Then above these valves, find the master switch and turn it on, then move the arming switches to arm. All of that stuff was on the left side of the cockpit. Now you're going to have to switch hands on the control yoke and move the rocket bomb selector switch to bomb. Switch your hands back, press the release button. The tanks will drop and you're ready to dogfight. Sitting here in my chair, I find that takes me about 10 seconds or so to go through all these motions, from moving the mixture controls up to pressing that release button. In a real airplane, it would likely be a bit longer. Even so, in 10 seconds, the P-38 and the Oscar would be about 1.5 miles away from each other after a head-on merge in this situation, and the Oscar is small and hard to see. So imagine yourself in this situation. Are you going to take your eyes off the enemy airplane and look down at those fuel selectors? Of course, you could do the whole procedure by feel, and U.S. World War II pilots were trained to do that. A big part of their training was on being able to manipulate every control while blindfolded. The reason for that is apparent in this example. Still, you're at low altitude, and if you screw this up badly, you could accidentally shut off both engines. So are you going to risk glancing down at those selectors and switches, or do you risk losing sight of the enemy airplane? There was also an emergency release mechanism, which was in some but not all P-38s. I don't know if all or any of the Lightnings involved in this discussion were so equipped. If so, the procedure could be to move the fuel selectors to the desired tank and pull the emergency handle to release them. There are other factors here as well. In formation, you really need to make sure you know where your buddies are before you drop those tanks. You don't want to take out your wingman. Plus, there's a little more engine management to be done here as well with the various cooling shutters on the airplane. It could be that McGuire decided that the safer course of action was to keep the drop tanks on and not have the distraction of dropping them. I can't pretend to know what he was thinking. Keeping the drop tanks on was the wrong call, but I can only say that because of what we know now. Based on what McGuire knew, or at least reasonably expected at the time, it may have been the right call. It's important to keep in mind that the biggest threat to U.S. fighter pilots, especially at this point in the war, was not enemy fighter planes. It was accidents caused by things like screwing up manipulation of the fuel system. Of course, McGuire knew this. Whatever the reason, the P-38s kept their drop tanks on and entered into a turn fight with an Oscar, flown by a very experienced Japanese pilot. Not only that, they were at low altitude without a speed advantage and with their performance greatly degraded by the drop tanks. Back to the mission, we left off when Lieutenant Throp made a hard 90-degree turn just after the merge, but then found Sugimoto's Oscar lining up for a gunshot. After his radio call, and with the tanks on the plane, Throp started jinking and using the P-38 speed to avoid Sugimoto's gunfire. This worked. He didn't get hit, and with Sugimoto following him, the other P-38s were able to line up on the Japanese fighter. Major Rittmeyer took the shot and either hit the Oscar or Sugimoto saw the tracers and broke off his pursuit of Throp. Sugimoto went into a hard turn, and as he came around, he saw the other element of P-38s coming at him. These were, of course, being flown by McGuire and Weaver. As the Oscar started to line up on Weaver, he called on the radio, quote, "He's on me now," unquote. At this point, the P-38 pilots had to know they were dealing with a really good Oscar pilot, not some poorly trained rookie. Weaver was behind McGuire at this point, both of them in a tight turn, or at least tight for a P-38 carrying drop tanks, but the Oscar was, of course, easily outturning them. In order to take the heat off of Weaver, McGuire decreased his turn rate to make himself a more tempting target for Sugimoto. At least that's why I think McGuire eased up on his turn. We don't really know. Sugimoto, seeing this, changed to the easier, more tempting target, which was now McGuire's lead P-38. As Sugimoto lined up on McGuire, Weaver saw what McGuire did next. He reported McGuire at this point, quote, "increased his turn rate tremendously," unquote. Weaver then said, quote, "he snap rolled to the left and stopped in an inverted position with his nose down 30 degrees, unquote. Major McGuire simply didn't have the speed or altitude to recover from this, and he hit the ground and his plane exploded. This was, of course, fatal. At this point, Sugimoto tried to escape by climbing into the clouds, but he didn't quite make it. Throp put a 3-second burst into his plane, hitting the wings and fuselage. For decades after this, it was thought that Sugimoto came back out of the clouds and shot down Major Rittmeyer, but we now know that is not what happened. Sugimoto wisely decided to use the clouds as cover and tried to make it back to his base. However, his plane was just too badly damaged to do it, so he made a gear-up landing in the jungle only a couple miles from where Major McGuire went down. Philippine guerrillas were the first at the crash scene and tried to capture Sugimoto, who resisted and was then killed by small arms fire. Shortly after this, another Japanese combatant entered the fight. This was Tech Sergeant Fukuda, another very experienced Japanese fighter pilot. He had been flying since mid-1941 and was the most experienced pilot in his squadron, or the Japanese equivalent of a squadron. Worse still for the remaining Americans, Fukuda was flying a Ki-84 Frank, probably the best Japanese fighter of the war, superior to the P-38 in air-to-air combat, and Fukuda had a lot of time in this type of aircraft. Fukuda had been chasing down the 3 P-38s as they were chasing the Oscar. The U.S. pilots were unaware of this. Thus, when they gave up the chase of the Oscar, they changed course and inadvertently ended up putting themselves head-to-head with the incoming Ki-84. Fukuda opened fire on Rittmeyer's P-38 at maximum range and held the trigger down until he had to maneuver to avoid a collision. The two planes passed within 10 meters of each other. Fukuda's aim was true, and Rittmeyer was killed by the Frank's 20mm cannon shells entering the cockpit. Next, Fukuda went after Lieutenant Throp, who at this point very wisely dropped his external tanks. Fukuda scored some hits on Throp's P-38, but doing so allowed Captain Weaver to line up for a shot on the Ki-84, and Weaver's bullets struck home. Fukuda's Ki-84 was badly hit in the wing and the fuselage, including a hit to the oil cooler, which meant that the Frank's engine would soon quit. Throp escaped into the clouds, and the damaged Frank couldn't really continue the pursuit. Fukuda also flew his Frank into the clouds, thus Weaver couldn't finish him off. Fukuda, his engine failing, headed for the nearby Japanese airstrip at Carolina. This was only a few miles away, so he was able to make it. However, the landing gear on his badly damaged plane collapsed on one side when he touched down. The plane flipped over, and Fukuda was badly injured. The Japanese ground crew counted 49 hits from Weaver's P-38. As a bit of trivia, Fukuda fought this entire fight with a 150-kilogram bomb on his airplane. Both remaining U.S. fighters became separated in the clouds, but both made it back to Durag about 10 minutes apart. I want to stress that there are different accounts of this fight. We have them from the two surviving U.S. pilots, which are not in total harmony, nor would I expect them to be. We also have Filipino eyewitnesses on the ground who were interviewed sometime later, and information from Fukuda, who survived the war. The narrative I have laid out here is the best I can do with what we have. Sadly, the gun camera footage from the surviving P-38s, along with reconnaissance photos taken of the area shortly after the battle, have been lost to time. One question mark here is whether Sugimoto shot down Major McGuire or not. Lieutenant Throp was of the opinion that McGuire could have been hit from Sugimoto's gunfire. However, that was not shown in the official typed-up version of his report. Captain Weaver said that McGuire was out of range of Sugimoto's guns and could not have shot him down. I am of the opinion that McGuire was at least in range. Otherwise, I don't think he would have turned so hard as to lose control of his airplane. Whether Sugimoto's bullets hit McGuire's plane or not, we don't know. Only portions of the wreckage have been recovered, and as far as I know, they don't show any bullet damage. If Sugimoto didn't shoot down McGuire, at the very least it was a maneuver kill. I want to talk about the last few moments of McGuire's flight. He was a very experienced pilot and certainly knew the limits of the P-38, so why did he stall in this tight turn? Just to clear up any possible confusion, during the turn, he snap-rolled the plane into an inverted position. The way this happens is by pulling back a bit too hard in the turn and generating an accelerated stall, meaning a stall that happens at a relatively high speed due to the G-load. Then, with a little asymmetry from a rudder input or asymmetrical power, the plane can flip violently. This is an aerobatic maneuver called a snap roll, and in some cases, like this one, it can happen inadvertently. I have no doubt McGuire had flown the plane in tight turns many times on the absolute limit of the stall. However, I seriously doubt he had practiced that with drop tanks on the plane, and that changes everything. The weight of McGuire's Lightning at the time of this engagement was about 18,500 pounds, really heavy because of all the fuel. Had he dropped his tanks, it would have been down to 16,840 or so. Still heavy, but better. Let's take a look at the effect that would have on the plane's stall speed. At 18,500 pounds, with the gear and flaps up, the stall speed for the 38 is about 104 miles per hour indicated. At 16,840 pounds, the stall speed drops to just under 100 miles per hour indicated. Keep in mind, we don't know if McGuire was using maneuver flaps or not. We do know that he used them a lot, and it's one of the P-38's excellent features. I tend to think he was not using them here, as they have a maximum allowable speed of 250 miles per hour indicated, and the flight of P-38s were slightly above that at the start of the fight. Nothing in any of the reports indicates the speed of McGuire's plane at the time he was being fired upon by Sugimoto. Whatever the speed was, the actual accelerated stall speed of the P-38 in a tight turn would have been around 8 to 10 miles per hour higher with the drop tanks on the plane. Looked at another way, it would stall with a lower G loading on it when in the turn. I think this was a big factor here, and I'm going against some well-researched stuff that says McGuire's decision to retain the drop tanks was not a factor in his demise. I disagree. I think it's the main factor. According to the Filipino eyewitnesses, McGuire hit the ground, then hit some trees farther along the flight path, then hit a ravine, at which point his plane exploded. That indicates that he wasn't in a very steep descent, and by extension, I think he almost recovered from the snap roll and saved himself and the plane. It's not at all a stretch to say that if his stall speed in the turn had been 8 miles per hour lower, as it would have been without the drop tanks, that he would not have stalled and thus not have crashed. Had he stalled without the tanks, he may have been able to recover because he almost pulled it off with the tanks on there. Of course, had he not stalled and snap rolled, then it's possible Sugimoto's guns would have found their mark. Remember, the Japanese pilot broke off his attack on McGuire once he saw him enter the snap roll. So had McGuire retained control of the plane the whole time, there's really no telling how this would have played out. I want to remind you that McGuire wasn't flying his usual plane on this day. Every plane is a little bit different. The way the engines respond, the way the controls are rigged, everything contributes to sort of an overall feel. And although the plane he was using that day was, as far as I know, a perfectly good P-38 with no known problems, I do think when flown at the edge, it was probably just a little bit different from his regular mount. The whole flight represents a bad series of events. The mission plan to try and get McGuire 3 kills in one mission because the clock was ticking put the wrong kind of focus on this mission. Let's not forget there were 2 other U.S. pilots here who were only 1 kill away from ace status. That probably occupied some of their thoughts as well. Then the weather prevented them from playing to the P-38's strengths, and combined with their flight plan and navigation, put them into a merge with the latest model of a Key 43, and against all odds, one flown by an expert. Then the decision not to drop the tanks really made everything go pear-shaped. With those tanks on, the P-38 was only slightly faster than the Oscar-3 at low altitude, and it was far less maneuverable. Major McGuire ended up with a well-flown enemy fighter plane on his tail, and he couldn't outrun it, he couldn't outturn it. He made a desperate gamble with a very tight turn the plane just couldn't do, and that ended in tragedy. It's somewhat ironic considering that his writings specifically say that there was no Japanese fighter which could be outmaneuvered by the P-38 except for the Japanese twin-engine Nick. McGuire's Guide on Combat Tactics even described exactly the tactics Sugimoto used after the merge. He specifically says that after a merge and a head-on, Japanese pilots will use a tight climbing turn to try to get on the tail of U.S. fighters. That's exactly what Sugimoto did, and it's how he ended up behind Throp so quickly at the start of the fight. McGuire's own advice to counter this is keep going straight and keep your speed up. Don't turn until you're clear of trouble. After reviewing the battle and reading the document, it's clear to me that McGuire was violating a lot of his own rules, as well as the normal procedure, which is to drop the external tanks when in combat. I think the pressure of the so-called ace race got to him. Had he followed General Kenny's advice, which was to take it easy, just try to get 1 kill a week or so, he would have survived the war and maybe as the second highest scoring U.S. ace, but maybe as the U.S. ace of aces. We'll never know. I do have McGuire's Combat Guide in the Pacific War folder on Patreon, so please consider joining and check that out. I also answer all questions there and sometimes have Patreon-only preview videos. On the subject of that Combat Guide, I guess I have one more thing to add in regards to this battle. McGuire in his guide pointed out that when down on the deck, a hard brake turn can be used as a last resort, but that it would only prevent the enemy from holding his lead on you. He wrote this in the section about the Key 61 Tony, but the principle with the Oscar is the same. This will throw off the enemy's aim, but it's a short-term solution because now you're losing speed and playing the enemy's turn fight game. I think when McGuire made that hard turn, he knew it was a desperate move. He knew things were not going well and probably hoped that one of the others in the flight would shoot down the Oscar before it was too late. Maybe that would have happened if things had gone differently, but the accelerated stall and sudden snap roll into the inverted position sealed his fate. Another thing I notice here is that McGuire's preferred direction for a brake turn was to the right, but in this case he was already in a left turn and so he broke harder in that direction. Pilots do have a certain amount of muscle memory and are often a little better to one side than the other. This is true with aerobatics, crosswind landings, and other things. I think all these small factors added up, the different airplane, the left versus right turn, but most of all the drop tanks. Even so, let's remember he almost made it. Another thing that's easy to forget is that at the time of his death, McGuire was only 24 years old. Here he is on the right, and to me he looks closer to 34. I think the war was taking a toll on him, as it would on most of us. While I do have to conclude that McGuire made some bad decisions on this flight, it's important to consider that he made many more good decisions along with important contributions to the U.S. Army Air Force during his time in the Pacific, and at 24 years of age. I think most of us would have succumbed to that much pressure and made some of the same bad calls at the end. McGuire was a real hero. In regards to the Japanese pilots, those two seem to be real pros, some of the few remaining at the time. Note that they took down two element leaders, McGuire and Rittmeyer. I don't think that was by chance. Clearly, when he shot down Rittmeyer, Fukada was targeting the lead plane. Sugimoto ended up on Throp's tail at the start only because of Throp's unexpected hard turn. As soon as he was able to, he switched targets to McGuire. It's interesting that the wingmen were the only ones not shot down, and only Weaver's plane was undamaged. Throp's plane had 20mm hits in the left turbocharging system and the right tail boom. That hit to the turbo system reduced engine power on that side. Thankfully, Throp made it into the clouds and was able to escape from Fukuda's Ki-84. It's interesting to note that Throp, the least experienced pilot in the group, was the one who finally made the decision to drop the external tanks, something I think should have been done much sooner. As for why McGuire's plane went out of control, I am firmly in the camp that thinks it was an accelerated stall for the reasons I have described. I'm certainly willing to concede that hits from Sugimoto's guns may have contributed to that, either by damaging the wing or the controls of McGuire's plane. There are a lot of other theories about the cause of McGuire's crash: ground fire coming up at him, a bird strike, G-lock, structural failures, and so on. But in my opinion, none of these hold up to scrutiny. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, and have a great day.